The social behavioral approach to personality. Sometimes this is abbreviated and just called the behavioral approach. And the reason for that is that the focus is largely behavior, although technically there is social psychology in here too, and so we call this the social behavioral approach. The focus, though, largely being behavior, and you remember that probably from the fact that that's embedded in this word and our first day of class when we pointed that out. But let's look a little more closely at this focus. Okay, so behaviorists, they prefer to focus on behavior. They've shown that your personality is learned through classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So a large part of your personality is actually learned rather than inherited. And since you know that about 50% is inherited, now you can figure out, of course, that about 50% is learned. Okay. Now, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, hopefully this is a review for you guys when we cover these very briefly. We will review them very briefly, but you should have had this in 101, and you might remember that that word conditioning means learning. Okay. So the focus is on overt behavior, overt meaning observable. Okay, behavior. So the learned component of personality, learned, overt, observable behavior. All right. And the behaviors, they choose to focus on the outcome of personality. So behavior rather than personality itself. And those of you who study behaviors in other class know that. That is a tradition of that field is instead of using measures that we have now, like the computer, to try to figure out what's going on in the brain, which we'll really get into on the cognitive approach. They prefer to look at behavior. So there we go with our focus. And classical conditioning, there was actually somebody who foreshadowed classical conditioning, actually used it before Pavlov did. So even though Pavlov tends to get the credit because he was the one who gave it the name, who gave it the term, and did much more systematic research on it. Hey, some of you might know who it was who foreshadowed that and actually unveiled this technique earlier, and that was J.B. Watson. Hey, so J.B. Watson worked with a little baby, and he actually taught little Albert to be afraid of white mice. Hey, and I want you to look closely at this picture before conditioning, and you will see that little Albert was not born afraid of mice. No babies are born afraid of mice. And in fact, you can tell here that he's very curious. He's actually reaching out, wanting to touch the mouse. Okay. Now, what J.B. Watson did was he actually paired the introduction of the mouse into that room along with a very loud, sudden sound. And that is something that babies are born afraid of, is very loud and sudden sound. And so every time that little Albert would see that white rat, okay, after that first initial exposure here, where you can see he's not afraid of it, okay, every time after that he saw it, J.B. Watson would pair this really loud and scary sound, and you see what's happening here. At the end, not only was little Albert afraid, very much afraid of white mice, but he also showed fear of anything white and fuzzy. So here's a picture of Watson with a white Santa Claus beard on, and you can see that little Albert is crying and trying to get away. He did, work with little Albert to undo this fear afterwards. Okay. But like I said, Pavlov gets the credit, and but J.B. Watson actually preempted this. So Pavlov, hopefully that rings a bell for many of you, and you all just got that pun, right? Okay, so Pavlov worked with what kind of animal in his lab? Okay, And you might remember that he worked with dogs, okay? And he's the one who gets credit for coming up with classical conditioning. And so defining classical conditioning, learning by trigger association. Now I get a lot of students coming in at this level who say learning by association. I want you to insert that word trigger. And remember, learning by trigger association, because it can be a little confusing otherwise with operant conditioning. This is what really distinguishes it. Because if you think of it, operant conditioning is learning that we're going to study next or review next briefly. That's learning through reward and punishment, right? Operant conditioning. So reward and punishment are also associations with the behavior. They become associated with the behavior. But learning by trigger association means that associated thing comes first, right? And that's what's really going to help you remember and keep these two apart, classical conditioning. Learning by trigger association. So what was the story with Pavlov's dogs? Well, he trained them to associate food, which is something that animals naturally salivate to, the smell of food, right? And he taught them to associate that with what? With the sound of a bell, okay? Hopefully you all remembered that one. So at first, if you worked in his lab and you rolled those great big barrels of dog food out into the middle of the floor of their room, all the dogs would go nuts, right? They'd be barking and wagging their tails and jumping up the walls, and some of them turning in circles, all of them salivating, right? But Pavlov, started ringing a bell before the big thing of food was introduced into the room. And after that happened a number of times, and it was always followed by that food, then the dogs started reacting to the bell in the same ways that they were reacting to the food, that they react to the food. So the one he chose to measure was salivation. But all of those ways they were reacting to the bells. So wagging their tails, jumping up and down, climbing the walls, turning in circles, barking, salivating, so on. Now, I want to review some terminology here very quickly and make sure that you're up to date on it and remember it from 101. And here we go. So the unconditioned stimulus, remember that there were 4 terms that you should be able to identify in any classical conditioning phenomenon that we give you, okay? And the unconditioned stimulus is the one that evokes the response from birth. It evokes a response right from birth. It's, you're born with it. It's innate, okay? And so in the case of Pavlov's dogs, what would be the unconditioned stimulus? And the answer to that is a food. And the unconditioned response is the natural, in other words, unlearned, you're born with it, response to the unconditioned stimulus, in this case the food, and you know that that is salivating. We're going to add a little something here and say salivating to the food. Because sometimes, not always, but sometimes the conditioned response is the same behavior, but it's to something different, right? So we're going to say when you answer these questions about unconditioned and conditioned responses, we will say something to the something. All right. The conditioned stimulus is the learned one. So in this case, it is what? It is the bell. And the conditioned response is salivating to the bell. All right. Let's just do 2 quick practice ones on that. And then if you feel that you need more practice on this, feel free to go and see a TA. If that isn't ringing a bell back from 101 psychology clearly for you, and you don't feel confident facing the test and identifying these 4, they can give you more practice ones and work with you until you've got this mastered. All right. And here's your first example. Often when Owen passes Terry in the hall, he knocks him on the head just to make him cry. Now Terry ducks every time he sees Owen approaching. All right. I want you to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. Ideally, you're going to be turning off this video. Remember that conditioned means learned. Unconditioned means you're born with it, right? So go ahead and turn off the video, write down your 4 answers, and then come back to check them. And the answers are, we have a drum roll. All right. Unconditioned stimulus here is the knock on the head. Unconditioned response, crying to the knock on the head. The conditioned stimulus, okay, is the sight of Owen. You might have put, sees Owen approaching, same thing, right? And the conditioned response is ducking. So this is one of those examples where you don't have to say ducking to, the sight of Owen, because this is one where the unconditioned response and conditioned response are actually a little different. But note here, classical conditioning works for human beings. And it also works for other species too. So I have a cat named Yossarian. And the only time I use his cat taxi is to bring him to the vet. The first few times were for his shots. Now when I put him in his cat taxi, he cries all the way there. They learn this one really quickly, don't they? All right. So again, I want you to identify these 4, pause the video, and come back for the answers. The answers are the unconditioned stimulus, okay, are the shots. That's the shots. And the unconditioned response, this one's interesting because you can imply it, which is you might have put pain or crying to the shots or something like that, but it's kind of implied in here. And then the conditioned stimulus is a taxi. If you got that wrong and you put that for the unconditioned stimulus, remember that no animal's born afraid of an animal taxi, right? They learn that. So the conditioned stimulus is a taxi, and the conditioned response is crying to the taxi. Okay. A couple more terms that I want you to be familiar with: stimulus generation and stimulus discrimination. Okay. And what I want you to do is to imagine again that you're working in Pavlov's lab. Okay. And you know how a lot of times our laboratories on universities sometimes are actually off campus. When they are, they're usually pretty close to campus because we want students to be able to get to them. We prefer to hire students first in these, give them first dibs on these jobs. But sometimes we either run out of space on campus or there are other issues. And so I want you to imagine that you are working in Pavlov's lab and they are moving their lab to off campus, and they're going to be renting a wing of a high school that's not being used. Okay, and because of the dogs barking and the noise on campus, this wing happens to be more soundproof and less connected right to it in the high school. And so they're moving over there. And once they've moved over there, hey, something's going to happen every day. What happens many times a day in a high school, in the rooms, in the hallways? And you might have guessed the bell rings, right? How do you think those dogs are going to react? Well, they're going to react like it's Pavlov's bell. Right? They're going to react like it's food because they're going to expect the food to be coming. Okay? And how long do you think that that's going to happen? Because the food is not going to follow those bells, right? It's only going to follow Pavlov's. How long do you think it's going to take them to pick up on that? Now, you might have guessed a few days. You might have guessed a couple weeks. And it really depends on the dog, right? And the species. So if we look at labs, for instance, particularly bright species, would expect there'd probably be a shorter period of time overall for them to pick up on it. But when they're reacting, when their reaction spreads to this bell. That is called stimulus generalization. So the conditioned response spreads to similar stimuli. And once they figure that out, though, that the food's not following that, and they stop responding to that bell, then that is called stimulus discrimination, because now the response is restricted to the specific stimuli. So in other words, they can discriminate between them. They can tell the difference, right? All right. Here is my favorite example of classical conditioning. And yes, this is from an episode of The Office.
That's not a file. I have to reboot again. Hey, Dwight, do you want an outside? What do you think? In school, we learned about this scientist who trained dogs to salivate at the sound of a bell by feeding them whenever a bell rang. So for the past couple of weeks, I've been conducting a similar experiment. Dwight, want an outside? Okay. Outside? Sure. Intubate? Intubate? Yes. What are you doing? What?
I don't know. Well, my mouth tastes so bad all of a sudden. Well,
Classical conditioning in the personality. So how does this play into your personality? Classical conditioning. Learning by what? 2 words? Trigger association, right? So how does this play into your personality? Well, it really plays the most strongly into your attitudes and your preferences. So a lot of your attitudes and preferences you actually learn. Now we talked about, some that were more genetic when we looked at the biological week under BUS, remember? Like preferences for women to have, for instance, usually fewer mating partners. But now we're talking about those 50% that are learned, right? And phobias are one example. So we are, just like we talked about the fact that cats are not born afraid of cat taxis, neither are babies born afraid of spiders, okay? And this is one of the ways that they can learn it. One of the ways that they can learn this is through classical conditioning, through the spider being paired with, every time they see a spider, mom screams, or dad freaks out. This is the typical way that oftentimes they learn this. If they're actually bitten, that'd be a little different, right? That would be operant conditioning. So they can learn it either way, but oftentimes this is actually learned through classical conditioning. Philias is another example, and that is things that you're sexually attracted to, objects that you're sexually attracted to, and that arouse sexual arousal. And I put a beach ball here as an example because it's kind of the cutest example I've ever heard. But one guy was talking about the fact when students were giving examples of this, he talked about the fact that when he was a little boy, okay, the neighbors had one of those above ground, like 5-foot pools. And they didn't have a pool. And of course, living in Phoenix, you want a pool. And they lived in Phoenix, so you want a pool in the summer, right? So, of course, you're going to spend a lot of time over at that neighbor's house and make friends with their kids and be playing in their pool. Well, apparently, the babysitter was out in the pool a lot, who wore a bikini, and they would throw this beach ball around. And one day she was throwing the beach ball to somebody and her bikini top came down. And he claimed that to this day, beach balls do it for him. So the sight of a beach ball. But it really is a great example of a philia. Hey. Other attitudes, so a lot of your attitudes, they don't have to be phobias or philias, are actually classically conditioned. Let me give you an example. A little girl named Phyllis, and she grew up next door to an older neighbor girl, and the older neighbor girl was really mean to her. Her name was Sherry, and she was really mean to Phyllis. And because Sherry was a Girl Scout, Phyllis' mother could not convince Sherry to join the Girl Scouts later on, even, when the mother pointed out that this was a different chapter. Okay, Sherry would not be there, and Phyllis still refused. She had no interest in being a Girl Scout. She associated Sherry so strongly with the Girl Scouts that she actually wanted to stay away, right? She wanted to avoid that situation. They had a negative attitude about the Girl Scouts.